Welcome, friends, to part one of a 15-part series called The Space Between, in which we are looking at the space between the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, the Old and the New Testament, as it's often called. This is in conjunction with the sermon series that we'll be doing on Sundays and the Lectio Divina podcast that we're doing on Tuesdays. These videos will also have a live discussion of on Thursdays. All this information can be found in the description down below, as well as at communityucc.net. We hope that you'll be able to join us for at least some, if not all, of these. So, as I was planning this series out, and I was thinking about just this period in between the Old and New Testaments, I thought, well, we can't just start there. We have to go a little bit further back. We probably have to go a little bit further ahead, too. And then maybe a little bit further back than that, and back than that, and pretty soon, before I know it, I was at the beginning of the world. So we're going to start today with a kind of overview, Reader's Digest version of biblical history, starting at the period of the end of Israel as we know it. Because at this point in the 700s BC, there were the northern tribes of Israel, the 10 northern tribes of Israel, and the 2 southern tribes of Judah. And so in 722, we meet the Assyrians, the first major empire to come out of the Middle East. This would be the first in a quick succession of a bunch of other empires that would rise up, conquer the one before, take their territory, and turn the world upside down. It was a super tumultuous time. So the Assyrians had this strategy in which they would conquer a land and then disperse their people, send in other people through forced migration and slave trade in order to just eliminate the culture of that land. The idea being that if you just destroy a culture and a people, there's not going to be any kind of rebellion or revolt because they won't have any kind of national identity. So for all intents and purposes, this invasion of Israel is the end of the northern 10 tribes as a people. Though it's worth noting that you can't deport everyone, and you can't rob a people entirely of their national identity or their familial identity or their religious identity. You just can't do that. And so keep in mind that the people of Israel were never completely driven from the land when we get back around to talking about Samaria later, and the conflicting origin stories of the people of Samaria between those who were actually in Samaria and the Jewish people much later. But that'll be in a couple of weeks. So the southern 2 tribes lasted down there for a couple hundred years until Babylon came into the picture. Surely you've heard that name before. Nebuchadnezzar, try to spell that. Nebuchadnezzar and them, they conquered Jerusalem in 586, 587-ish BC, burned the temple, took away all of its treasures up into Babylon, deported all of the rich, the land-owning, the powerful, the tradespeople, anyone who was worth something to them, they took out of the land. This was their strategy for overturning and subjecting a people. You leave the poor behind because they're easy to control, and you take away all the powerful into slavery, and you set them up in your hometown. You see, at this point, Judaism is not really a learned faith. There is no holy book quite as we know about it today. There's no Bible. There's not really a memorized Torah as far as we can tell. Judaism at this point is primarily a practiced religion. It's something that you do. You go to the temple, you make the sacrifices, you do this and you do that. And so without a temple, and without access to their holy land or even the mountain itself, what do? There's this massive identity crisis that the people who have been taken away into exile start having during this time, in which they can't practice their religion. So how do they do it? The writer in Psalm 137 says, "How can I sing songs of Zion in a foreign land?" They can't fathom The idea that God could transcend national boundaries, that God could go with them without physically going with them in the ark or in the temple or in the tabernacle, that God could dwell within them. This idea is more of a modern conception. To them, it was over. Everything was done, it was over, and this great identity crisis started being formed. And at this point in their history, the tone of the prophets changes. Now, if you've read any of the prophets, especially the earlier prophets, you look at someone like Amos, for example. Amos's main tone, his main word, is a word of warning. He says, people, turn around right now, or else God's going to come in and destroy you and wipe this away. And now that's already happened. So the tone of this changes a little bit. And it starts to change to stay faithful. And God's going to wreck our enemies eventually and send us home. This is about the time we start to see Ezekiel, Jeremiah. Actually, most of the book of Isaiah starts to get written during this period. Isaiah was a real prophet, by the way, who was prophesying in Judah around the time that Assyria was destroying the northern tribes. And the followers of Isaiah who are in exile start to write these passages, start to expound on the writings of their teacher. This is not at all seen in the way that it would be now. You know, like if I were to start writing in the name of my seminary professors, people would not appreciate that. It was not really frowned upon back then. This is pretty common practice. So the writers start talking about this coming Savior. This coming Messiah is the word that they use. This suffering servant Messiah figure. And that if you just hold on long enough, and if you're just good enough, you just stay faithful enough to something in exile, then this Messiah will come and save us from this situation. This is when you look through the book of Isaiah, the New Testament really picked up on a lot of these prophecies. See if any of this sounds familiar. And behold, a virgin shall conceive, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, God with us. Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. The people who have dwelling in darkness have seen a great light, and those dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. Or how about this one? The voice of the one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. There are dozens of quotes or allusions to this part of Isaiah scattered throughout the Gospels and the writings and the rest of the New Testament. Jesus gets in on it himself. We read about him going to his hometown in Nazareth. He says in Luke 4, Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and news about him spread throughout the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. Jesus went to Nazareth where he had been raised. On the Sabbath he went to the synagogues as he normally did and stood up to read. The synagogue assistant gave him the scroll from the prophet Isaiah. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, quote, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoner and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. He rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the synagogue assistant, and sat down. Every eye in the synagogue was fixed on him. He began to explain to them, today the scripture has been fulfilled just as you heard it. Yeah, so Jesus is picking up on this messianic idea that starts around this time when the people are struggling to figure out how to worship God and who they are in exile. If they can't practice their religion, who are they? Well, there are people who follow God. Well, what does that mean? Well, we're people who stay faithful to whatever practice we can here and now, right? But the question comes up, well, faithful to whom? Faithful to what? To what belief system? If we don't have a Torah, if we don't have the rest of the Bible, if we don't have teachings, if we don't know what we're supposed to believe or do or say, then whose belief system, whose God am I supposed to be faithful to? And that question, friends, gets pretty messy when good old Cyrus comes around. When the Persian kingdom comes and destroys the Babylonians, takes over their kingdom, expands it to the greatest kingdom in terms of size that the area had ever seen and ever would again until Alexander the Great much later. In Isaiah 44, we read about Cyrus as this divinely appointed king, as God's right-hand man. The book of Ezra talks about him in the same way, because Cyrus comes onto the scene and he sends the Jewish people back home. And he gives them the money to rebuild their temple and their walls and their city. And the Bible talks about Cyrus as someone who was divinely inspired by God, who is a servant of God, of the Jewish God, of the God that is above all gods. He may be this foreigner, but he is one of God's anointed, appointed messiahs. And that's a pretty good story, honestly. It's not the story that Cyrus tells, though, which, politics and history, super fun, right? When you're writing something, you're always trying to portray your narrative. So the way that Cyrus describes this in his own writing on a cylinder that we call the Cyrus cylinder that was discovered a couple hundred years ago, he says, quote, "From Babylon to Ashur and from Susa and then from a bunch of other towns that I'm not going to name, whose sanctuaries had been abandoned for a long time, I returned the images of the gods who had resided there. Note to their places, and I let them dwell in eternal abodes. I gathered all their inhabitants and returned to them their dwellings. May all the gods whom I settled in their sacred centers ask daily of Baal and Nabu that my days be long, and may they intercede for my welfare. May they say to Marduk, my lord, quote, as for Cyrus, the king who reveres you, and Cambyses, his son." So according to Cyrus, he didn't just do this for the Jewish people. He did this for everyone that the Babylonians had come in and stripped of all of their gods and their national treasures. He sent them all back home. He gave them money to rebuild their temples, to worship again, to regain their sense of national identity, so that he could be seen as a benevolent Lord and the people would be happy, and happy people tend to pay their taxes. That was an innovation that Cyrus and the Persians did, a system of taxes and a happy people. So, according to Cyrus, he sent them all back for peace, and also so that all of those other gods might put in a good word with Baal and Marduk and Nabu, his gods. So we have these kind of conflicting storytelling here, and that's important. That's important not just for this story, but for every story. For every story that we're going to tell over the next 14 weeks. Every time we talk about history, and especially history that is wrapped up in national identity and religious identity, we're going to bump into creative storytelling, we'll say, of people who claim, conflictingly often, this is what God said, or this is what God did, or this is what was at the heart of this, or this is the reason why this happened. And anytime you read that, use that as an opportunity to learn something new about the people who said it, more so than to learn about the actual objective history of the thing that happened. Remembering that objective, fact-based history is a modern conception, much more than an ancient one, in which they're using history to convey their ideals and their beliefs and what matters to them. This is important as we move into this next period of Persian rule. Because what happens with Cyrus is he sends the people home. And when the people get home, they find people are already there, right? So a lot of the folks who came home from Babylon, these were the priestly class, the kingly class, the rich class, the craftsmen, the tradesmen. When they come home, they find that there's people still living there who were generally the poor, the lower class. And the people who were still living there, they say, well, we never left. We are the true children of Israel. We've been worshiping on the rubble of this mountain for the past 100 years. You people, you went off to Babylon, you left, and you came back with all this dangerous new teaching which you learned up in Babylon. You've been mingling with the Zoroastrians a little bit too much, and you've come home with this new theology and this new way of looking at God, because how could they not? And the people who came back, they said to the folks who were still there, you all intermarried with Canaanites. You're worshiping these Canaanite gods. We're the ones who kept the faith in exile while you were here, doing God knows what with God knows who. And if you read the book of Ezra and into Nehemiah, you see a lot of xenophobia start to come to the surface. A lot of this people identifying who they are by identifying who they're not. So in many ways, this period of time, this period under Persian rule, will define who the people in Judah are going to become, because they work really hard to define who they're not, and what it means to be a child of Israel, and what it means to be in the line of David, to be a true Jewish person in those days, which, by the way, means something very different today. And that's going to be extra complicated by the fact that there's still a large contingent in Babylon who never comes home. There's also a contingent in southern Egypt that never went into exile. And these four groups, plus, the Samaritans who are still there, will kind of continue to fight and to argue and to mix and to marry and to combine and to separate. And in this messy process, we're going to start to discover who we are. And so next week, friends, as we talk about what it's like to live under Persian rule and what it's like to live in the Jewish diaspora all over the world, we're going to start getting into some of the messiness. And honestly, this is the most exciting bit for me, because we'll start to see, almost like when the flowers start to emerge out of the snow in the spring, you'll start to see things that remind you of Christian thought or of the Jewish thought of the New Testament. And you'll say, oh yeah, I see that. That's where that's coming from this group and this group who are now in conversation, and they come up with this new idea and that new idea. And this kind of frantic, frenetic interworking is so beautiful and so exciting. And I really look forward to going more into depth with you next week. Go in peace, friends.